Hey, so today I'm still looking at Jung's relationship with Christianity, and this is taken from the compilation put together by Murray Stein, Jung on Christianity. And I've done there's a lot. Most of the book I've already presented, but there's one essay here which I found to be profoundly relevant. So basically, Murray Stein has taken selections from all of Jung's works that are most pertinent to his relationship with Christianity. There's stuff from Answer to Job, from Ion, from his letters, from Memories, Dreams, Reflections, um, all the way through his corpus. And so today I'm going to be looking at the Introduction to Psychology and Alchemy, which for me is one of the key texts in Jungian thought. The series in dreams, which I was my way of finding a key to interpreting Jung. Um, that came from part 4 of Psychology and Alchemy. Okay, and so today this is going to be about um, the, it's the introduction to the religious and psychological problems of alchemy from Psychology and Alchemy, which is volume 12, and it's paragraphs 1 to 43 and pages 181 to 211. So it's a 30-page essay. And for that reason, well, it's going to be about Christ. It's going to be about the relationship between Gnosticism and Christianity. And it's not so much about alchemy, actually. It's more about the church and more about, well, it goes into the problem of 3 and 4, which is partly why I find it so interesting. And so I hope that uh, one knows how interesting Jung can be, but also how complex it can be. It took me several days to read through and annotate this essay. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to move relatively quickly through the first at least half of the essay so that we can get to the stuff that I feel is more interesting. And so my way of doing that, I'm not going to read the entire essay. I'm going to rely on what I've summarized to be Jung's argument and what he's saying. And I will, go read it yourself if you would like to corroborate what I'm saying. So what I've tried to do is simply read each paragraph and write little summaries about what he's saying. So my intention has been to try to understand, not to evaluate. I will try to indicate if I want to stop and say something original about what Jung is saying. So let's begin. And it might seem a little disjunctive because I'm not going to be reading what he's saying. I will try and quote, but I'll do my best here. So let's try and get into it. So first of all, unsurprisingly, Jung sets out with the suggestion that alchemy and individuation are deeply connected, which is a hard thing to grok, hard thing to understand or to get. So the process of individuation, the way that we sort of become more whole or total over the course of our lifetime, has deep correspondences with the process that Jung finds in alchemy. And so the concepts that are relevant to either alchemy and individuation are in common. He claims as well to be a scientist. Jung argues as a scientist, he feels that the conclusions that he draws about the nature of the human psyche are drawn from his observations of people. And so he's asking us to appeal to empirical observation of things like the reality of the self as a center of consciousness between conscious and unconscious halves of our totality, the ubiquity of mandala symbolism, for example. Despite that, he also argues that the psyche is fundamentally a mysterious phenomenon. Quote, but anyone who really knows the human psyche will agree with me when I say that it is one of the darkest and most mysterious regions of our experience. Um, so there's a way that he feels that expertise is really required when investigating the psyche, and it's very easy for us as lay people to dismiss the findings of his psychology just based on our unfamiliarity with what actually goes on in the psyche because of our modern devaluation of it. I find Jung's attitude in this essay to be quite defensive, and that's part of the reason why I don't want to exhaustively quote everything that he has to say. Let's move on. he says that despite the fact that the psyche is mysterious, that we can find what he is pointing to if we look within ourselves. So he's saying that the what he's pointing to in theoretical terms are empirically verifiable realities. Then he describes a little bit of the analytical process that's involved in his version of psychology. And that involves a kind of dialectical discussion between the conscious and unconscious minds. So he really thinks of this as that our consciousness is a kind of island within the sea of unconsciousness. And these are like spheres of our mind, of our total being, and that they're engaged in dialogue, and that this dialogue in analysis is drawn out, it's amplified. It's also clear that the process of psychological sort of treatment in analysis, but also the process of individuation, they aim towards something. They have a certain goal or direction, and we get to that. That's what we mean kind of by individuation. There's something teleological or going somewhere about the individuation process, and namely going toward the realization of the self, going toward our actualization of who we are, living in a more whole, complete, and total way. And he claims that analysis, psychological analysis, often finishes, it ends before that goal is reached. So there's a way that to conceive of this really carefully, individuation is sort of going on throughout the life course. And the idea is that this natural process can be facilitated or assisted by conscious engagement in analysis so that we can actually consciously participate in our own individuation. And so this is a way of going with nature. It's a way of, it's in a way, it's accelerating, but you can't, it's not just about accelerating and making it faster. It's more about uh, making such a process more conscious and participating consciously in our own individuation process. Despite that, even when formal analysis, when a psychotherapeutic relationship, when it uh, finishes, when it ends, individuation still is often continuing underneath the surface. So this is what I kind of mean. It's like this formal analysis is like a way of bringing up or evoking or helping along a process which is continuing anyway. So that inner dialogue, again, between conscious and unconscious, continues under the surface. Hence, it would be true to say, and Jung indeed does say, that the psyche actually works toward its own goals. Quote, it was experiences of this kind which first confirmed me in my belief that there is in the psyche a process that seeks its own goal independently of external factors. Okay, so the idea is to, in an empirical way, to try to perceive, to realize in an unbiased way, what is it that the psyche is striving toward? And Jung's idea is toward wholeness, toward totality, toward the expression of what he calls the self. Moreover, Jung wants to say that the analysis of neurosis, which is kind of like where the sort of psychological tradition kind of had its roots in a way, like, hey, there's something wrong with these people, let's kind of try and fix them. This sort of opens up the problem of individuation, like it's revealed through the treatment of neurosis, the analysis of neurosis, a problem that is far beyond a medical problem. It's not exactly that we have to sort of fix something that's wrong with someone in a certain way. It's like the problem of individuation is the problem of our life, of our development, of our growth, of our being in the world. And so by this token, he feels that he notices that extended analysis often yields what he calls positive results. There's a way that this kind of extended dialogue with a therapist, according to Jung, can um, support the process of individuation. He also claims that the analyst always ends up being deeply affected. Jung's way is for the analyst to deeply involve themselves with the problems of the client, the analyst, and to involve themselves rather than standing back. Anyway, I won't get hung up in a discussion of whether or not Jungian analysis it's as a practice is helpful. We can say it could be quite true that over extended analysis there could be something that's supportive about that kind of a process. But we can see the underlying dynamics of individuation that are occurring regardless of whether we're engaged in Jungian analysis. And it's that we're going to focus a little bit more on. Again, he talks a little bit about uh, what it means to engage in that kind of therapy. And he's saying that just as in alchemy, um, the art requires the whole man. It seeks the involvement of the whole person to transform ourselves on the way of individuation. Hence, it's also true that what we seek is wholeness. We seek the whole expression of ourselves, which actually seems like a kind of contradiction. Like, isn't the if the practice of psychology requires the involvement of the whole man, and that's exactly what we're trying to seek, well, isn't that what we don't have? But I think I would say it requires commitment, it requires investment, it requires involvement, it requires that we don't leave out parts of ourselves, that we engage in the work, and that by so doing, we can actually bring ourselves to deeper expression. We can bring ourselves more deeply into the world. We can allow ourselves to grow and change and transform by virtue of that commitment. That's pretty obvious. So let's continue. He points out that this is not a straight path. It's a path that involves circumambulation. It goes around and around and it's just kind of a 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of a process. Yeah, for him, this path specifically involves uniting the opposites. There's a way that it's a pathway, the pathway of individuation is one where we sort of progressively constellate these different conflicts within us, these different oppositions, binaries, polarities. And then the Jungian way is to sort of sit with that conflict, to be with that conflict in such a way that we can kind of outgrow it um, in a way which is not a kind of Hegelian synthesis, but something a little bit more organic. And he claims furthermore that um, there's a certain kind of experience that we might call Gnostic experience that's not very accessible. And Jung claims that on this pathway, the pathway of this, uniting the opposites on the way of individuation, that we encounter inevitably experiences that require a lot of effort. It's when we can constellate these pairs of opposites within us, when we realize that our inner conflicts as a source of binary opposition in our life, then sitting with that conflict can be profoundly demanding and effortful, and require us to feel riven, to feel torn apart, uh, or in a sense crucified, enough that a sort of natural organic solution can arise from out of our own inner depths. So it's a difficult process. It's a demanding process. It it's a process of consolating our inner conflicts in such a way that it demands wholeness from out of us. It calls us into uh, a fuller expression of our own being, and that process is difficult to say the least. Okay, so Jung continues here with sort of a bit more about the context of where this sort of thing is coming from, the process that he describes. And he's saying that we find processes like that partly so difficult because our religions, which kind of form the backbone of our culture, in a sense of the notion of a sacred canopy that I won't go into here. But there's a way that our religions over several thousand years have not educated us in psychology. They're in a way um, religion is supposed to sort of relate equally to the outer man and to the inner man, and it hasn't been doing that. And he feels that in the Christian West, this is not caused by the best version of Christianity. He's not saying that we should blame Christianity for this. He feels that it's actually mainly due to human incompetence. It's mainly due to the difficulty of the process that we're talking about, that it can be quite easy to focus on the outer or on the object and to leave the inner world alone for lack of familiarity. And then he makes a claim. He says that there's a demand made by the church that we ought to imitate Christ, the imitation of Christ, that we should seek to sort of follow the ideal and we should seek to become like that ideal. And logically, that should kind of result in the development of the inner man. That should support us to develop our inner nature. Um, but in fact, he observes that that ideal, quote, has been turned by superficial and formalistically minded believers into an external object of worship. And it is precisely this veneration for the object that prevents it from reaching down into the depths of the psyche and giving the latter, the psyche, a wholeness in keeping with the ideal. So the way that he feels that when we relate to Christ as an object, it actually prevents the quote unquote true nature of Christ from transforming our own inner depths. And he says, accordingly, the divine mediator stands outside as an image, while man remains fragmentary and untouched in the deepest part of him. So there's a way that it's merely an image or a kind of object that we relate to. So he feels that our sense of the ideal was turned into an external object of worship, and there's something prohibitive about that, something restrictive about it. And so he says, for it is not a question of an imitation that leaves a man unchanged and makes him into a mere artifact, but of realizing the ideal on one's own account, God willing, in one's own individual life. So he's saying that the ideal must be realized in one's own life, and that this doesn't come about by veneration for the object, and certainly not in the way that we've done it. But he does concede that even though a kind of imitation which he feels is mistaken, uh, even though he doesn't recommend that, he recommends realizing the ideal in one's own life, which is to take Christ as a kind of prototype, um, which is slightly different than the recommendation to imitate him. He does feel that even so, sometimes this mistaken imitation can serve its purpose. It can it requires so much effort for people to imitate Christ in that way that sometimes that this can allow us to, quote, catch a fleeting glimpse of our wholeness. But he doesn't feel that it's the best way. He feels that it's a kind of outward way. It's merely outward imitation of Christ rather than it changing or transforming our inner nature. And so he feels that Western consciousness in particular is kind of quite enthralled by the 10,000 things in comparison to the Easterners. He feels that Westerners are quite focused on the object. And when we relate to an object in that way, this tends to sort of fix the ideal into it makes it literalizes or concretizes the ideal, and it focuses on the outward aspect of that ideal, and thus robs that ideal of its mysterious relation to the inner man. So in a way, the object is depotentiated. It's not recognized in its power to transform the inner person. And he feels that this is a kind of prejudice toward the object. And he feels that it's this prejudice which, quote, impels the Protestant interpreters of the Bible to interpret Greek phrase referring to the kingdom of God as among you. The kingdom of God is among you rather than within you. So there's a kind of looking away from the within, moving away from interiority or de-emphasizing interiority, which he feels comes at a great cost. Obviously, he says that it's really hard for us to approach an understanding of the Eastern mind. And so it's very easy for us to jump to conclusions uh, about doing that, even though it's necessary and important for psychologists to try to come to an appreciation of a different perspective, different way of being in the world. And he says that, mm, yeah, so quote, Christ, the ideal, took upon himself the sins of the world. But if the ideal is wholly outside, then the sins of the individual are also outside. And consequently, he is more of a fragment than ever, since since superficial misunderstanding conveniently enables him, quite literally, to cast his sins upon Christ, and thus to evade his deepest responsibilities, which is contrary to the spirit of Christianity. So Jung is arguing that when we conceive of Christ as an object to be that is venerated, to be worshipped, to be imitated, that this is a kind of misunderstanding of Christ. It's to conceive of him as a kind of holding vessel for all of our sins, and that sort of allows us to avoid taking responsibility for those sins. So there's a way that it's only when we take our sins upon ourselves uh, that we can actually transform ourselves. And so there's a way that that attitude is uh, contra Christianity in a certain way. Again, he says, quote, such formalism and laxity were not only one of the prime causes of the Reformation, they are also present within the body of Protestantism. If the supreme value, Christ, and the supreme negation, sin, are outside, meaning outside of us, then the soul is void. Its highest and lowest are missing. So there's a way that both what is most high and what is most low, sort of Christ and our sin, they're both considered outside us. And so there's a way that this, in a sense, cuts off the soul from, which is in a way within, from its limits. And he makes this contrast with the East again. So again, quote, in the Eastern attitude, more particularly the Indian attitude, is the other way around. Everything, the highest and the lowest, are within the transcendental subject. And the effect of that is that the significance of the Atman or the self is heightened beyond all bounds. So it gives, but with Western man, the value of the self sinks to zero. Yep. So there's a little confusion here about differentiating the terms of self, but basically what he's pointing out is that when we focus on the object and regard what is most high and what is most low as being sort of outside ourselves in a certain way, then we devalue what is within. And when we devalue what is within, we blind ourselves to what he calls the self, we devalue the soul, we devalue the psyche, and that has the effect of actually cutting us off from transformation. It actually prevents us from uh, quote unquote optimal development. And so this kind of attitude, which is very old attitude that we have, which he feels is a kind of prejudice toward the object in a certain way. He feels that this is the origin of the fact that the psyche is grossly devalued along with nature. So both the psyche and nature herself are devalued. As he says, quote, anything psychic is only nature, and therefore people think nothing religious can come out of it. At the same time, such critics never hesitate to derive all religions, with the exception of their own, from the nature of the psyche. Yeah, so there's a little, he's pointing out the contradictions in our modern scheme, in our modern way of looking at things, our modern metaphysics. So it's a kind of devaluation of the interior. I mean, this is why Freud was such a revelation, right? It's like, hey, we have an inner life and it's chaotic. Um, so the psyche is devalued, nature is devalued. These go together, and so because these aspects of being devalued, uh, we don't feel they're devalued in such a way that they couldn't possibly produce anything religious. It's like uh, it would be blasphemy to suggest uh, that a religious experience is a psychic process. So it's regarded as only psychological, that sort of attitude. But at the same time, this modern kind of person also looks at religion and says that that is psychic in origin. We say, oh, this is, people's way of coping with the world and so on. And there's a direct contradiction there. Because the whole point is um, religion is not only psychological, but yes, it does religious experience does uh, in some way come about as a result of a psychic process or can be understood with psychology. It's natural in a certain way. Okay, so we'll move on here. So yeah, so he does feel that this kind of an attitude is a hubristic attitude. We devalue the psyche out of our own hubris, the hubris of the ego. Yeah. How do we know so much about the psyche that we can say only psychic? For this is how Western man, whose soul is evidently of little worth, it's a quote unquote, of little worth, speaks and thinks. Yeah. If much were in his soul, he would speak of it with reverence. Okay, so if I keep going here, let me see. So again, Jung feels that the soul, sort of within the psyche, is devalued out of our hubris. We don't know much about our own psyche, and yet we feel that the soul is of little worth. And the question is obviously, how do we know? The idea being that our soul is in fact incredibly rich, that it's been endowed with that richness as a result of many thousands of years of, in a way, investiture in the soul. And so Jung feels that there's a way that the soul is actually incapacitated through religious projection. So there's a way that we give a significance to objects, what he calls objects. And even if we get beyond the subject-object thing that we see in the Kantianism of Jung, we can still, in a sense, notice that there's something true about projection, as the Jungian notion, right? There's a significance that we give to the way that things affect us, the way that things are in themselves, which is misrecognizing that the significance that we give comes from out of us. So there's a way that this is what Jung would classically call projection. And I want to understand that we need to modify our notion of projection since we can't hang on to the Kantian subject-object split through that we get through Descartes. So we have to update our notion of projection, but we can still recognize that we do in fact project, and there's a very real depotentiation of our soul that comes from that. As he says, so insignificant does the soul seem that it is regarded as hardly capable of evil, much less good. But if the soul no longer has any part to play, religious life congeals into externals and formalities. So he feels that obviously, like when we think of the quality of soulfulness, right? Having soul, what does it mean to have soul? Well, it has life, it has animation, it has aliveness, it has vitality, it has uniqueness, it has energy, it affects us personally in the deepest way. So yeah, there's a way that our regarding the things as the power of objects um, incapacitates us and cuts us off from the source, the foundation of religious life, which is the involvement of the soul. We sort of quote unquote fall victim to the delusion that the cause of all misfortune lies outside. We devalue ourselves deeply. In a way, it's kind of unconscious victimization of ourselves regarding that things always happen to us. And so he says that in fact, sort of on the contrary, the reality of the situation is that the soul has the dignity of an entity endowed with consciousness of a relationship to deity. So there's a way that the soul is conscious of a relationship to God that we are not. Or we could say that the soul is that faculty within us which is conscious of the relationship to God. It's from out of the soul that we relate with God, which makes it, in fact, incredibly honorable, dignified, as he puts it. So far from there being a reason to devalue it, it is conscious of a relationship with God, the means by which we relate to God, and capable of good and evil, and integrally involved in the process of individuation that he considers to be the sine qua non of psychic life and life in general, I would say. It's the process of development. And so then he says, the immortality of the soul, insisted upon by dogma, exalts it above the transitoriness of mortal men and causes it to partake of some supernatural quality. So there's a way that it, despite our devaluation of the soul, it's also regarded as immortal. So there's a way that we regard it as having supernatural qualities, at least in the tradition, right? And so the significance that it gains is through this notion of the immortality of the soul. And so I would call about this that this is a kind of imbalanced relationship with the soul. There's a way that if we regard our soul as immortal, there's something scary about that. I think there's something intimidating about that that may make us disregard the importance of engaging with it and the significance of working with the soul in this life now and here. So this is what he might call a kind of devotional attitude rather than a relationship with equality to the soul. however we look at it, it's clear that we don't comprehend the soul. As he says, the eye to the sun, so the soul corresponds to God. There's a way that our conscious mind doesn't doesn't comprehend it. And that's what makes it so ridiculous to speak of the things of the soul in a patronizing or depreciatory manner. We're not in a position to know what is true about our souls, whether we overvalue it as something that has supernatural qualities in a way, or whether we undervalue it as something that is sort of quote unquote only psychic. Anyway, let's continue here. So he suggests that dreams can be sent by the soul. I'll read what he says. So he says, even the believing Christian does not know God's hidden ways and must leave him to decide whether he will work on man from outside or from within through the soul. So this is the idea that the way that God works upon us is through the soul when he works upon us from within. And then he says, so the believer should not boggle at the fact that there are dreams sent by God and illuminations of the soul, which cannot be traced back to any external causes. It would be blasphemy to assert that God can manifest himself everywhere, save only in the human soul. So this is the connection between that belief and the empirical observation that dreams can be sent by God. There can be these quote unquote illuminations of the soul that don't come from external causes, but that in fact come from within. The soul can in fact be illuminated by God. It doesn't make sense. In fact, it would be blasphemous to assert that God can only come from everywhere except from within our soul. And then he says, indeed, the very intimacy of the relationship between God and the soul precludes from the start any devaluation of the latter. In the footnote, the fact that the devil too can take possession of the soul does not diminish its significance in the least. At all events, the soul must contain in itself the facility of relationship to God, a correspondence. Otherwise, a connection could never come about. Then he says, this correspondence is, in psychological terms, the archetype of the God image. Okay, so we have there's an empirical observation of the archetype of the God image, conceived in all the different ways across cultures. And that image is conceived here in psychological terms. And what it is a kind of correspondence between the soul and God. It's a way by which the soul connects with God. It's that God image is representative of the similarity between them. It's the God image is the means by which the soul participates in God, you could say. So he's saying again that the relationship between soul and God is in fact so intimate that the soul cannot be devalued, or should not be. So Jung is arguing that the soul is that which contains the facility of the relation with God. And it contains that facility in the form of the God image. It's through the soul that we engage with God, and specifically through the God image. And so to summarize here, this is partly why Jung is so interested in this process of individuation. It's this Again, in Jungian theory, the self is kind of like the term for God. It's this center of consciousness between conscious and unconscious, sort of center of awareness between conscious and unconscious. And from it, it derives these quote unquote symbols of the self or God images. And they arise up and into the soul and through the soul, and they have a transforming effect on the ego personality. And through by constellating the pairs of opposites within ourselves and holding the tension between them, we can evoke this, we can precipitate this process of the emergence of natural images of revelation, in a sense, um, of insight, of inner growth coming about from within, from within the soul and through the soul. And it's that process that is the aspirational process of individuation. Okay, so he's now claiming that because we understand this about the soul and about God, that the soul, again, at all events, the soul must contain in itself the facility of relationship to God, a correspondence. Otherwise, a connection could never come about. This correspondence is, in psychological terms, the archetype of the God image. He's saying that because of this, it's not true to conceive of God as only wholly other. God is not just that which is other. He thinks that if it is only that which is wholly other, it could never be, quote, one of the soul's deepest and closest intimacies. There's a way that God has to be sort of knowable in a sense in order to, quote unquote, be so intimate with the soul. He says the only statements that have psychological validity concerning the God image are either paradoxes or antinomies. So he feels that whenever we qualify God, God is defined as this, it's defined as this. It doesn't make sense, it's imbalanced in a certain kind of way. He says that the only way that's really valid to speak of the God image, which in a way represents God, literally, is with paradox. We saw pretty good examples of that in that episode, the round dance of the cross, which was about apocryphal Acts of John. Anyway, we'll move on here. So these archetypes of the God image, these symbols or images which arise from deep within, they can be more or less developed, according to Jung. It's very easy for these God images to be identified with externalized ideas. As he says, in an outward form of religion where all the emphasis is on the outward figure, the archetype is identical with externalized ideas, but remains unconscious as a psychic factor. When an unconscious content is replaced by a projected image, to that extent, it is cut off from all participation in and influence on the conscious mind. So there's a way that for us to participate in our own transformation in this way, we have to withdraw our projections and be conscious of that which is coming about from within. When we project, when we identify the God image with an externalized idea, we remain unconscious that that is actually an inner object. It's something which is within us. The consequence of that, it may easily happen, therefore, that a Christian who believes in all the sacred figures is still undeveloped and unchanged in his inmost soul, because he has all God outside and does not experience him in the soul. His deciding motives, his ruling interests and impulses do not spring from the sphere of Christianity, but from the unconscious and undeveloped psyche, which is as pagan and archaic as ever. Okay, so this is this profound contradiction that he's pointing to. So when we objectify, when we worship an object, or you could say an idol, when we in a way conflate that with God, we leave ourselves undeveloped. We cut off our own inner development. And that this means that despite the quote unquote sophistication of Christian worship, our undeveloped psyche is very much pagan and very much archaic. So there's a way that in a sense, the Christian phobia of the psyche, the inner, actually reinforces the the prevalence of our quote unquote pagan roots. So it means that our motives, our ruling interests and impulses are not as developed as they could be. They're decidedly archaic still. So there's a way that he sees that Christianity has not touched the pagan roots of our condition. The real cause of things, the way they are in the world, has these really deep roots inside us. It's really, they're very ancient and deep within us, roots that are both ancient in time and deep within us, that are deeply involved in the way that things are, and he feels that Christianity doesn't really touch them. Quote, Christian civilization has proved hollow to a terrifying degree. It is all veneer, but the inner man has remained untouched and therefore unchanged. His soul is out of key with his external beliefs. In his soul, the Christian has not kept pace with external developments. Our inner development is atrophied. Our inner development is atrophied. And so inside reign the archaic gods, supreme as of old. That is to say, the inner correspondence with the outer God image is undeveloped. The inner correspondence with the outer God image is undeveloped for lack of psychological culture, and has therefore got stuck in heathenism. So there's a way that our atrophied inner development has left us under the rulership of these archaic gods which reign within us. Didn't he say the gods have become neuroses once before? And there's a way that our Christian education has proved insufficient. It hasn't allowed us to work with the forces that are so powerfully moving us about. As he says, too few people have experienced the divine image as the innermost possession of their own souls. Christ only meets them from without, never from within the soul. That is why dark paganism still reigns there, a paganism which, now in a form so blatant that it can no longer be denied, and now in all too threadbare disguise, is swamping the world of so-called Christian civilization. So he feels that there's a direct connection between our lack of Gnostic experience, our lack of direct experience of the God image on the one hand, the progress of our inner development on the other hand, that those go together, first of all, the success of Christian culture and Christian education, thirdly, and then the condition out in the world, fourthly. The way that things are is directly as a result of the fact that we are cut off from the deepest sources within us of divinity. And as he says, the dark inner paganism is swamping the world, which we see in, Psychology and Religion was originally published. I'm trying to find out when. It was one of his later works, so it's after the Second World War. Yep, so Psychology and Alchemy originally published in 1944. So it's like he's really seeing in the middle of World War II the consequences of this lack of facility with our inner nature and how that's directly connected with the worship of Christ merely as an object. And so he points out something quite significant here, which is that the empirical foundations of religious experience are accessible with psychology. Now, I want to read the quote that he shares just because I'll let him speak for himself a little bit. Whoop, nope, sorry, I skipped forward a page, so that's one of the insights from the next page. Let me, sorry, just reorient to where I'm speaking from. We were talking about the World War II. Yes, we haven't experienced our God images, our souls are undeveloped, Christian education has not been sufficient, and that's playing out in the world as we see it today, as we see it in 2025, as well as in 1944. And so there's a way that the soul has not been Christianized. The soul has not been Christianized. We've been, as he says, the Christian missionary may preach the gospel to the quote, poor, naked heathen, but the spiritual heathen who populate Europe have as yet heard nothing of Christianity. Christianity must indeed begin again from the very beginning if it is to meet its high educative task. So there's a way that we have to re-educate our inner nature. As he says, so long as religion is only faith and outward form, and the religious function is not experienced in our own souls, nothing of any importance has happened. It has yet to be understood that the mysterium magnum, the great mystery, is not only an actuality, but is first and foremost rooted in the human psyche. The man who does not know this from his own experience may be a most learned theologian, but he has no idea of religion and still less of education. So the experience of God is real. It's sorely needed. It's rooted in the human psyche, and it's the basis of religion. And theology often has very little to do with that. And so here we understand that the soul has a religious function. As he said, yet when I point out that the soul possesses by nature a religious function, and when I stipulate that it is the prime task of all education of adults to convey the archetype of the God image, or its emanations and effects to the conscious mind, then it's precisely the theologian who seizes me by the arm and accuses me of psychologism. And so he does get a little bit polemic, so that's why I'm partly skipping those parts. And basically he's arguing that the soul has a religious function, and that's really important, and psychology has a proper role in making that accessible to people. So the supreme value, the great mystery, it resides in the soul. And he feels that that is what is interesting about psychology. As he said, but were it not a fact of experience that supreme value resides in the soul, psychology would not interest me in the least, for the soul would then be nothing but miserable vapor. But on the contrary, he knows from his experience and from hundredfold experience meaning the experience of many, that the soul, on the contrary, it contains the equivalence of everything that has been formulated in dogma, and a good deal more, which is just what enables it to be an eye destined to behold the light. So there's a way that our dogma is externalized, and it exists in experienceable form within the soul. This is what is so important about it, and the prime task of psychology is to make this available to us. And so he's defending himself against the accusation of deifying the soul, and he says, "Not I, but God himself has deified it. I did not attribute a religious function to the soul. I merely produced the facts which prove that the soul is naturaliter religiosa, i.e., it possesses a religious function." So he feels that it's an empirical observation that we can prove that the soul has this religious function. It naturally possesses this religious function. It's not something that we attribute to the soul in a certain way. As he says, with a truly tragic delusion, these theologians fail to see that it is not a matter of proving the existence of the light, but of blind people who do not know how to see, who do not know that their eyes could see. It's high time that we realize that it's pointless to praise the light and preach it if nobody can see it. It's much more needful to teach people the art of seeing. It's the title of a book by Huxley, The Art of Seeing, anyway. For it is obvious that far too many people are incapable of establishing a connection between the sacred figures in their own psyche. They cannot see to what extent the equivalent images are lying dormant in their own unconscious. In order to facilitate this inner vision, we must first clear the way for the faculty of seeing. This has to be done, how this is to be done without psychology, that is, without making contact with the psyche, is frankly beyond my comprehension. Okay, so what he's saying here is that not only does the soul naturally possess a religious function, but that the true task of theology is to help people to see the God, to see the divinity, to experience that. And we really do find it very difficult to connect these sacred figures that we regard outside with our own psyche, with our own mind. So there's a way that we need to learn to see God again. Viveki said, seeing God again for the first time. And so there's a lot that's getting in the way of our vision. It's the task of psychology to remove the dross which is obscuring our perception of the divine. It's about seeing clearly. It's not about dogma. As he says, in religious matters, it is a well-known fact that we cannot understand a thing until we've experienced it inwardly. For it is in the inward experience that the connection between the psyche and the outward image or creed is first revealed as a relationship or correspondence like that of sponsus and sponsor, bride and groom. So there's this prioritizing of inward experience for the sake of understanding, for the sake of its transformative knowledge. I mean, so look how existential, look how phenomenological this is. It's actually constitutive of our way of being in the world. It's not about dogma, it's about seeing clearly. It's in our inward experience that we first know, that we first understand, that we first realize that there is a connection, a correspondence like that between Christ and church, between the psyche and the outward image. Within our inward experience, these connecting relationships are revealed within inward experience, connecting relationships are revealed. So in this way, he feels that psychology can be understood as the science of the soul. Psychology is a science, and therefore it deals with the empirical. Science can only be science, as he says. There are no scientific professions of faith. And so he wants to limit himself to the empirical. Again, psychology as the science of the soul has to confine itself to its subject and guard against overstepping its proper boundaries by metaphysical assertions or other professions of faith. He claims that we don't know the origins of the psyche or the origins of the archetype of the God image, for example. The fact is that there are these God images, but that doesn't prove that God exists as such. He says, nothing, so wait, he says, the competence of psychology as an empirical science goes only so far as to establish, on the basis of comparative research, whether, for instance, the imprint found in the psyche can or cannot reasonably be termed a God image. Again, this is why I'm trying not to read what he says because it's very tortured. Nothing positive or negative has thereby been asserted about the possible existence of God, any more than that the archetype of the hero posits the actual existence of a hero. So the fact that there are these archetypal images does not prove that there is a God. We don't know, psychologically speaking. So again, as I was saying earlier, this is where we get to the bit where it's like the psychological researchers that we can engage in, they open up the possibility to approach the empirical foundations of all religious experience. And so those empirical foundations are accessible with psychology, and that's powerful and important. So science, one way or another, cannot avow the faith of belief. It's not the concern of science. So he's trying to avoid those metaphysical claims. Yeah, and so he says the fact is that with the knowledge and actual experience of these inner images, a way is opened for reason and feeling to gain access to those other images which the teachings of religion offer to mankind. So psychology does the opposite of what it's accused of. It provides possible approaches to a better understanding of these things. It opens people's eyes to the real meaning of dogmas. Far from destroying, it throws open an empty house to new inhabitants. So, so psychology has the effect of opening the way for our reason and for our feeling to approach the content of religious experience. So psychology is a way for people to approach these things. It's a way to approach these very old truths in a new way that can speak to them as modern people. Okay, I don't want this to be too long, so I may break it up because I've managed to reach 10 pages. Okay, so I'll come back to the rest of the introduction to psychology and alchemy.